Morning, everyone. I'm overdue on a Maxime Bernier Twitter roundup, so here we go. Maxime Bernier is tweeting early on July 19th, 4:30 a.m. He says, quote, "A political leader elected thanks to Dairy Cartel promises a Dairy Cartel assembly that he will change Canada's food guide so that it favors the Dairy Cartel's products, morally and intellectually corrupt." And this is a Huffington Post. This is commenting on a Huffington Post piece titled, "Canada's food guide is ideologically driven," says Scheer. "Doesn't reflect science." Mr. Bernier is tweeting, quote, "Islamism, or radical Islam, is the biggest threat to freedom, peace, and security in the world today. The other parties are complacent and pander to Islamists. The People's Party of Canada will make no compromises with this totalitarian ideology." Watch this video to learn more. And this was on the 19th as well, at 6 in the morning. And here's a link to the video. I found it interesting. I watched 4 minutes, and there were some things that I didn't know that were covered in this video. And it's quite interesting because the parallels, well, to Nazism and communism are made here, and it's interesting to note. It is interesting to note. So check the video out. The link is in the description. Mr. Bernier says, quote, "Canadian Muslims have been warning us for some time about the dangers of Islamism. Let's listen to them and stop being complacent." And he says the same in French. And here is a response he is responding to this tweet from Tariq Fatah, and Tariq says, "On May 3rd, 2004, I implored Canada's Muslims to end their silence about the excesses of Islamism in Time magazine. The next year, a few of us got the government to ban Sharia law from family courts. Unfortunately, the tide has reversed, and Islamists have infiltrated all of Canadians' institutions." That's concerning. That's concerning. And that tweet was sent by Tariq on 11th of July in 2019, so this year. So that's a relatively new tweet. Mr. Bernier says, quote, "Watch Salim Mansur explain why he chose to be a People's Party candidate." It's an interesting video, and I recommend watching it. The tweet, or the link to the tweet, is in the description. People's Party introduces local candidates in London, including Salim Mansur. And yes, I was there. It was interesting to be there. I enjoyed the speeches. I've talked about this a lot. I'm just including it because, well, if you don't watch my show, you may not have seen that. Here's Maxime Bernier again, and he says, "In the space of just a few years, we went from a situation where transgender people were rightly fighting unfair discrimination to one where they use kangaroo courts to harass people and try to confuse children about their identity. This story is downright disgusting." And this is a very concerning story. If you haven't seen or heard this story, here it is. National Post is reporting, and this was printed on July 19th as well. It says, "Rex Murphy, BC groin waxing case is a mockery of human rights." And here we go. "What has happened to the noble concept of human rights? The concept was most firmly implanted into modern consciousness after the unspeakable cruelties and mass murders of the Nazi regime were fully documented and published to the world. That was the horrid prompt for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The significance for human safety and dignity were then underlined by the revelations of the degrading torments and horrors of the Soviet gulags under communism. Both were a vast canvas of a world without human rights, of what a world without human rights looks like. It is perhaps the saddest story in the world that, since the proclamation, so many states have practiced and are practicing terrible incursions on the pure dignity and liberty that belongs to every single human being. It is also sad that the idea of human rights has become so degraded and trivialized. Where is the noble idea now, particularly in the comfortable and secure West, in this era of high progressivism? In British Columbia, there is, at the present moment, 16, quote, human rights complaints launched by a single person who asserts the status of trans woman against mainly immigrant female cosmeticians who, from religious sensibility, reasons of safety, or simple personal preference, refuse that person's demand for a Brazilian wax of their male genitals. Do we really want to call this a human rights case? To insist, for example, that a woman performing a waxing on a penis and testicles in her own home when she doesn't wish to, doesn't know how, and has a religious objection as well? Really? Do we think the formulators of the UN Declaration on Human Rights were careless when they left out the human rights to crotch grooming? I seriously wonder, if this story somehow made it to the ears of an incarcerated and tortured North Korean, how would he respond to the invocation of human rights law to cover such a matter? How could he, being beaten, doing forced labor on starvation rations, locked in for life, possibly with every family relation imprisoned too, intellectually or morally digest that in some way the cases in BC were being adjudicated under the same rubric of human rights as his situation? Let me proceed to another point. The litigant in this case, while posting under his masculine name, Jonathan Yanev, posted put up this quote, "We have a lot of immigrants here who gawk, judge, and aren't the cleanest of people. They're also verbally and physically abusive. That's one reason I joined a girls' gym, because I don't want issues with these people. They lie about shit. They'll do anything to support their own kind and make things miserable for everyone else," end quote. So we have a human rights tribunal, a person who speaks of ethnic immigrants, particularly women, as dirty and abusive and calls them, quote, "these people," that they lie, quote, "supporting their own kind," and that person is the complainant? Said complainant is also the person who most vilely went after Lindsay Shepherd, who is recently a mother, with a series of disgusting and most vulgar tweets. They are desperately ugly references to Shepherd's own genitals and reproductive organs. When Shepherd responded with totally justified harshness, she was banned from Twitter. Twitter is the slop pail of political correctness. The idea it has moral authority to rule on anything is benighted. Back to the main storyline, some of these women, obviously under strain to provide for themselves and their family, have had to close their businesses over all this. The stress they are under because of human rights complaint is itself something that might be filed under an abuse of human rights. The multiple and savage ironies in this case do not seem to enter the minds of those arbitrating what I regard as degrading and narcissistic triviality. And there's more. Read it for yourself. Link is in the description. Interesting how basically every time something difficult needs to be discussed, the way the media reports it and the way it's being looked at is not necessarily the way you or I would interpret the case, right? And especially when Max is discussing things, right? So like the responses to this kind of stuff and the responses from the media are interesting to note. Max is responding to this article, but I'm more talking about the media spin, etc. So when you have the courage, I suppose, to have these difficult conversations or state your position about these big things, like when does it become an ideology that needs to be at least quelled, not pushed onto children? That's my opinion. And at what point are we talking about equality? Well, we get into that. So it's interesting to watch all of this playing out in real time. Here's Mr. Bernier saying, "Reminder that at Michelle Rempel and the Conservative Party critic for family and children at Groin Vecchio are big fans of radical trans activism. It is part of the LibCon centrist consensus. I'm asking all true conservatives, how can you support this?" And this is that's Morgan Ogre and that's Michelle Rempel. And there's a screenshot of Miss Vecchio, who's saying, "Yes, I've sat down a number of times with Morgan. In order to represent all Canadians, you need to have an open and frank discussion. I 100% believe in equality for all. Morgan Ogre has shared her story with me, and in turn, that helps me and others. Her voice matters to me." And so she was tagged in this, and she responds. Hold on. Here's the response. She says, "Perhaps it is best that I wait 24 hours to make a full response. I'm just trying to figure out which Max to respond to. The one from a few years ago who worked with me and my office to help find solutions for equality, or the new 2019 version." And here's Mr. Bernier responding to that. He says, "Karen, I defend equal rights and respect for all. I will not legitimize radical left-wing trans activists who push their ideology in schools and want to take children away from their parents at age 6 if they refuse to let them start, quote, transitioning. You do." And he tags Ms. Vecchio again. So again, it's interesting to watch this all play out, because having children put on hormones that have not been tested for, for longevity, what's the long-term repercussions of these hormones on children who have not had puberty yet. And we seem to be okay as a society pushing this onto children. And I'm personally not, as it's, not a good idea, right? It's very, very confusing for children, as illustrated by a couple of articles, etc., that I've done reports on earlier in the week. Check out my other video backlog or back catalog to have a look at those. But once you're 18 years old, and I enjoy Mr. Bernier being able to draw the line on this. Like, what is the line on this? Because if you do it poorly, if you do it wrong, you're going to get activists anyway, but if you do it incorrectly, then they may have a point, right? Then you may have to walk it back or something to that effect. And I thought Mr. Bernier did this quite well. The line is when you're pushing it on kids in schools, right? Like, there's no reason to push this on children. There's no reason to teach children who have not entered puberty yet about any of this stuff. And when you push that ideology onto children, they like to please adults. And when you have entire networks like CBC, quote, celebrating this, you're reinforcing that for children. And that's not positive. That's not good, because the outcomes aren't good. The outcomes aren't good for people who decide to make a transition. And I've seen multiple people on YouTube, etc., talking about regret from that. And so once you're 18 years old, you are an adult and you have the right under Canadian law to make your choices. You can do whatever you like. And I respect that. You can do whatever you like at 18 years old. But before 18 years old, there should be no reason for people to be hijacking children and giving them hormones against their parents' wishes. And the parents shouldn't be able to force feed their children hormones that haven't been tested and things, and when we don't know the long-term effects. Because we could be setting up a health crisis 10 years from now. We could be setting up a health crisis 5 years from now from these people saying, we don't want this actually. Actually, this was a bad idea, right? And that's what I've seen on YouTube. And who knows? Who knows? So I think that it's very good of Mr. Bernier to draw that line. Like, if you want to live like that, then you deserve to be treated equally. But when you start to try and push your ideology onto children and to try and teach your ideology to children, that's the line. Don't cross it. Don't cross it. My goodness. Okay, moving on. Mr. Bernier saying, Canada's immigration policy is dysfunctional and needs to be fixed. I will unveil the People's Party of Canada platform on immigration next week. Listen to what the PPC candidates Salim Mansur and Mr. Haskell had to say about immigration in Cambridge yesterday. And these are your People's Party candidates. Follow and support them. Unity is our strength. I think that it's funny the amount of articles that I see and the amount of press who ask me about my worry about being associated with racists, etc., or a racist party. And I always say it's ridiculous to think that the People's Party of Canada is a racist party or a sexist party or a misogynistic party. Have a look at our candidates. These are the people who groups of Canadians have put forward to represent them. We'll just have a look. And if you can't see, well, the link to the tweet is in the description, and check it out. And I hope you look, because actions matter more than words, and I feel like the best person for the job should get the job, and it doesn't matter what your skin color is or your anything physical about you, things out of your control. That doesn't matter. It matters who you are and what you do, right? Like that's what matters more. That's what matters more. So that should matter more to everybody, but here we are. Here's Maxime Bernier tweeting, quote again, why is Andrew Scheer so obsessed about helping his dairy cartel friends? Why is he willing to throw away the last shred of principle he has left in order to please them? What kind of backroom deal did he do with them in exchange for their support? And this is in response to a Vice article. And here's another one. Ling, cold, hard milk. Its enticing allure is hard to resist. And indeed, many powerful people have fallen under her spell, but few have fallen harder than Andrew Scheer. And this is another response to the Vice article. Robert Stewart says, I chose to run for Mad Max's People's Party because, unlike the others, he listens to Canadians, especially small business owners like me. He puts Canadian first, not special interest. And unlike the others, he's a leader, not a panderer. And yeah, I would agree with that. Leftist Logic says Maxime Bernier. Says, Big Red X, man holding the door open for a woman. Big Red X, man complimenting a woman's look. Big Red X, man spreading. That's all toxic masculinity. Big Green checkmark, female cosmetician being legally forced to handle male private parts of man identifying as woman. That's gender equality, guys. Right? Interesting. And the last tweet for this morning is, there is no climate emergency, no reason to panic or be anxious, no consensus supporting climate alarmism, no justification to regulate and tax ourselves to death. Please watch this interview with Ross McKittrick with an open mind. And this was from back in April, I believe. Yeah, April 26th. And I've spoken to Mr. McKittrick, and he's very interesting to speak with, and he lives in Guelph. I'm hopeful that I can chat with him. I find it interesting the way they attack anybody talking about climate change, because they don't attack the arguments. They don't bother because they can't. What they do is they attack the person. They say, this person has never had, peer review. The paper's not peer reviewed. That's not how peer reviewing works. The person's not credible because of this reason. Their theory doesn't work because of this reason, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that stuff, I'm sure, you can find it on Google, but it just muddies the water further. And they don't argue against the points that he brings up. They don't argue against that. So it's really interesting to watch when you're trying to have an argument that the cup is blue, and they start arguing that the cup and the table don't exist. The cup the table is sitting on doesn't exist. The cup that's sitting on the table doesn't exist. And they're not the same argument. It may sound like the same argument. You might be talking about the cup, but it's not the same argument. So it's really interesting. Just watch them try to shift it. And people go along because because you want to have a conversation, right? We're human people. We try and interact. So when they shift the argument, you don't even realize it's shifted. You're just arguing with somebody. And it's so interesting to watch. But they can't attack the arguments most of the time. And the times they can attack the arguments, it's pretty flimsy. Okay. Thank you for watching. Check out the People's Party of Canada.ca. Oh, I went back to my old format, but I thought splitting up the Maxime Bernier Twitter roundup seemed kind of weird, right? Like, I don't know, because it's not all kind of the same, but it's all around the same motif. Let me know what you think in the comments. Should I have split it up into two like I've been doing? I'll do it. I'll be back to my splitting it up tomorrow, I think. Okay, check out the People's Party of Canada and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks for watching, everybody.